All right, so let's get back to the judge fixed effect. So what we're going to do now, is we're going to replicate. We're not really going to replicate. We're just going to together run through a do file, in an R package. Leave one out, our variable. So let's look at that leave one out. Unfortunately, Megan Stevenson's does not use the leave one out. Yeah, I have a little bit of trouble doing this. Let's look at this, okay? So the leave one out mean, right? The mean, why is it the mean? Because this is going to be an average, all right? It's going to be an average. And let's look at this. Okay, so NJI, this means the number of cases seen by Judge K, excluding the one they're with, right? So excluding this one, okay, that you're in. Over here, this is excluding the one you're in because you're person I. So Francisco, you're my judge, all right? And I come before you. You're gonna get I'm gonna get an average, but I'm not gonna count your decision with me, right? So that's what's going on here. It's an average over all of the decisions. They're calling it here, juvenile was incarcerated during their first case. That's some kind of, unique thing to this project. But basically, it's like whether the juvenile was incarcerated. The K judge incarcerated let's see. So it's a judge specific. Yeah, it's a judge specific average as you average over all the cases, not including the one that you're in. So you're going to everybody except for yourself. You're getting all those judgments and you're averaging kind of with like a taking in a degrees of freedom kind of correction by only averaging over yourself. Yes. Except for I. Yeah, I know. Jay is kind of, I got this straight out of the paper. But I didn't write down what J was. So I'll need to over the next, we'll follow up, Francisco. Okay. I'll reread the paper a little bit more carefully and tell you if I'm getting that wrong. Because I am not right now remembering why I didn't remember what J is. But it's effectively that. Okay. So it's effectively that. So it's basically excluding yourself, the sum. And I'll find the code. You know what I'll also do? I'll put the code up. Because I don't have the code right now, but I'll put the code up. All right, so let's open, while you're opening up this bail.do and bail.r, while you're opening it up, let me tell you a little bit about, is it like a smoothing? I think of it really more, I don't know, I wouldn't really think of it as a smoothing. I just would think of it as, I come before you, come before Francesco, and who am I coming? So I go before Francesco. Who is Francesco? He is someone that has incarcerated a kid 20% of the time before I ever saw him. I come before Juan. Who is Juan? He is someone that has incarcerated a kid 4% of the time before I ever got there. Now, how am I going to calculate that 4% of the time? I'm going to have to leave myself out of the summing, and I'm going to sum all the other adjudications, right, from every one of them, except for mine. So it's just really like an instrument that's defining exactly how we're going to get to 4% or 20%. But I'm going to get the actual code from my student who has done this specifically, this residualized, he did the residualized leave one out, but I'll get that and I'm going to just post it because I think if we just like sort of look through the code, we'll sort of see, it'll be a little bit more obvious. So while you're opening this, okay, while you're opening bail.do, let me tell you about what this paper is. So basically what this paper is Megan Stevenson is a professor of law at the University of Virginia. Virginia is a state in the United States, and she's at the University of Virginia. She's just now moved universities. That's where she is now. And she got data from, man, where was it? I don't remember where it was. It was some city. And when she got the city's, when she got that city's public data on all of their cases, she just downloaded it. So like, it was just posted to the internet and she just downloaded it, or she scraped it or something. And so what does she have in it? She's got identifiers for the judge. She's got the demographics of the offender. She's got whether it's a felony, a misdemeanor, and like characteristics: felony 1, felony 2, felony 3, misdemeanor 1, misdemeanor 2, misdemeanor 3, and I guess some kind of unspecified felony or misdemeanor. Felonies are the worst thing in the United States. Misdemeanors are lesser offenses. She's also got information on this person having prior offenses, and she knows the day of the week, whether it's the day of the week, the bail date. And so what is this happening? This is the bail judge that I was telling you about. So she is looking at the effect of being set higher bail, cash bail, on whether or not the person pled guilty. Okay, whether the person pled guilty. Now, why would this happen? This happens, all right, this happens because if the bail is too expensive, then they won't, if it's too expensive, they don't get out of jail, all right? And if they don't get out of jail, their bargaining power is worse, and they might just simply accept a guilty plea rather than go to court. It's weird, but it's like part of a debate in the United States as to whether or not cash bail is just a punishment for poor people who can't afford to get out, and actually is causing them to be found guilty simply because they're pleading guilty. Now look, ordinarily the thing is that the thing is about cash bail is, you know, they're setting bail higher for people that are risked, who have higher propensities to be guilty in the first place, right? So it's deeply endogenous. So what they're going to do is, we've got this jail variable for whether or not they go to jail. Let's look at it real quick. I think it's in here. Pre-trial detention. That means prior to the trial, they're in jail, all right? So when you just control for day of the week, fixed effects, and things like that, there's no relationship. 331,971 offenses. But when you control for every exogenous pre-treatment covariate, still uses the same observations, but being in pre-trial detention increases the probability of guilt. Let's look exactly what guilt is. Guilty of at least one charge, okay? Increases the probability of being found guilty of at least one charge, which can happen through a plea, by 3%. Not a lot, but finds it. Let's look at our two-stage least squares. So what we're going to do is we're going to instrument for jail with our judge fixed effect. So I think what I'm going to do, probably, maybe we'll do this together as an exercise. Now that I think about it, we might be able to do it on Tuesday. Is maybe we'll construct that picture, that histogram, by getting that z-score, but I'll figure it out. All right. But anyway, we don't have it right now. We're doing what Peter Hall says to do. We're going to instrument for pretrial detention with the judge fixed effects. Now remember, the judge fixed effects are, ironically enough, they're equivalent to the propensity score and the leave one out propensity score once we're estimating with jive. Okay, so we're going to have essentially, effectively, a numerical average of that average propensity score, because it's like the propensity score is unique to the judge. Okay, it's unique to the judge. So that's why it's going to be, you know, equal to the judge fixed effects. So we're going to estimate two-stage least squares. Two-stage least squares. Actually, let's look at, you know, before we do two-stage least squares, let's run the first stage. Okay, let's run the first stage, which is going to be JL3 XI colon JL3 $ judge pre. I don't need the XI. Let's see if we have any weak instrument problems. All right. There's one. Judge 1 is a weak instrument. Judge 2 is not. Judge 3 is not. Judge 4 is not. Judge 5 is getting dropped, okay, because Judge 5 is the omitted group. Judge 6 is not. Judge 7 is weak. And Judge 8 is weak. Okay, we need to do the Cragg-Donald F statistic, which I don't know the command for right now, but let's just do this. Test Judge pre 1. I think it should work. 2. 3, 4, 6, 7, 8. But we need the Cragg-Donald. So the F statistic is large, but we really need the Cragg-Donald, and I don't remember how to do the Cragg-Donald. So let's put that aside for now. But we've got that first stage, and we can just evaluate the weakness problem here, but we're going to probably need to do an over-identification test. All right, so let's do IV, two-stage least squares. We're going to first just do it with the controls. Controls are day of the week fixed effects. Boom, big effects. Even with just daily controls, we're finding that being in pretrial detention, which is occurring just because of variation which judge you were assigned, 15 percentage point increase in any guilty plea. Now let's do it with all of the controls. Let's see what happens. That went from 15 percentage points to 18.5. All right, that's two-stage least squares. Two-stage least squares has finite sample bias problems, and we do have some weak instruments, and we're going to have to think about that. Now let's do jive. Jive is a leave one out IV, two-stage least squares IV estimator. Incredibly, it goes actually reasonably fast. Pretty similar effects, probably because we don't have a major weak instrument problem, I'm guessing. I think this one does get a little different though, because it was 18, I think. What was it before? It was 18.5. I think this is 20 something. 21. Pretty similar, not huge differences, probably because the bias of two-stage least squares isn't very bad. You know, but if you had a lot of instruments, see, she only has 8 instruments. If you have a lot, 55, like Azer and Doyle, there's really no telling what's going on there. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any oh man, I don't think I'm recording, am I? Yeah, I am. Does anybody have any questions about that before we go on? It's like I'm saying though, for the graduate students on here, when I wanted to study the mental health courts in Texas, these specialty courts for mentally ill defendants, I didn't know where to start. I knew I wanted to study mental health care in the criminal justice system, and I didn't really know what to start with because it was a brand new area for me. So I just found a list of public defenders in the state of Texas, and I found one that was the public defender for the mental health court in Austin, Texas, or Travis County. And I just called her. Or I just emailed her. I just told her about myself, and I just said, can I take you out to coffee? Can I take you out to lunch? You know, and I did that several times. And when I went, I just took a pen and paper, and I just asked her over and over and over again, you know, tell me how a defendant gets into your court. Just explain it to me like I'm 5. Explain it to me from a. So I was never asking her if her program worked. Right? Because that was what I was wanting to know. And I just wanted to know, how was the treatment being assigned? And it was through those series of meetings that I finally heard the therapist assignment. I mean, it was like, it was just something about, I didn't go in and say, is there a judge fixed effects? Because I just really wasn't sure what the research design was going to be. But through in-depth conversations with the administrators of the program, I simultaneously built the relationships with the key decision makers, and I overheard her describe what effectively was a judge fixed effects design. It was not a true judge fixed effects design because we only have 2 mental health courts. So I can't really use judge fixed effects because I really don't have any variation in the instrument. Instead, what I discovered was there was this upstream therapist that was assigning numerical scores about how mentally ill the person was, and the scores were basically being randomly assigned because they had discretion over their judgment. And as a result of this quasi-random assignment, I have some identification. Now, of course, this is a long-term project for me. This isn't the only paper I'm going to write, but it's the first paper I'm going to write. And I'm just going to be estimating local average treatment effects. But I'm also going to do propensity score matching. And I'm going to be estimating average treatment on the treated for different projects, because you want the entire distribution of the treatment effects, not just one weird parameter. Okay. But if you're sitting on a judge fixed effects opportunity, you should definitely try to seize it. Okay. So let's go back to the slides. Let's go back to the slides. Let's look at the bartik. And I'll try to get through the bartik in 20 minutes, no more. Could not a control function approach that does not introduce bias be an option in this case? In which case, in my, well, what would you be doing, Diana? I mean, I usually think of the control functions as dealing with multiple samples. I usually think of them as with like Hackett corrections, but what are you thinking of it as? Okay, yeah. Get back to me on that, Diana. I've never seen anybody use it as the control function, but approach, but that doesn't mean you couldn't. Okay, so bartik instruments. What are these? They are very common in trade. They are very common in immigration. I don't know if you guys are familiar with David Otter's work on China. He uses them a lot. Leah Bustan at Princeton uses them a lot for studies of immigration, at least kind of like economic history studies about immigration. They're very common in labor also, which is again kind of trade labor, is David Otter's work. They're a bit challenging to defend, though. It's hard to defend all five of those identifying assumptions, but it's like for different reasons. Okay, but new work by Goldsmith Pinkham et al. In a forthcoming American Economic Review, and Borisak, Peter Hull, and a third person whose name I can't remember, at Review of Economic Studies, at least it's revised and resubmit. They at least are kind of providing some insight into how exactly these estimators work. Or it's two-stage least squares, so it's the estimator, but how does the instrument work, okay? So a little bit of some history of thought. Perloff appears to be the first person who sort of hinted at something that has a bartik-like feature. He noted that industry shares of a geographic region by some industry that could be used to predict income levels. Okay, so you basically have this idea of the share showing up, which we're going to talk about more about that, what that means, the share. You see that. Richard Freeman in a 1980 Journal of Human Resources article used the change in industry composition as an instrument for labor demand. So he's the first one using IV. It's not exactly the full pieces until we get to Timothy Bartik. Timothy Bartik is at, I believe, can't remember. It's in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I don't think it's the Urban Institute. It's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, he used to be at Vanderbilt, and then he went into to this other place. And he was studying his famous 1991 book, very careful book about regional labor markets in the United States. And he's the one that used the full shift share instrument. It's kind of based a little bit on Freeman's. But Bartik is the first one that really gave a very, very detailed explanation of the logic of the instrument, specifically how you have these national growth shares interacted with these this national growth shift interacted with these initial shares. I'm just going to call it national growth shares that create variation in labor market demand. He was really careful. He's just a very careful thinker. And because of that, and then later, Larry Katz, a year later, Larry Katz and Oliver Blanchard, they ended up citing it. And that caused the paper to really explode, or the book to really explode. Bartik, it gets named after Bartik. And I like naming it. I like that. So, you know, Bartik it's called a Bartik instrument to some people. Goldsmith, Pinkham, Swenson, and Sorkin, that's what they call it. But Peter Hall and the other co-authors, they call it shift share. You'll hear them call it the same thing. So here's what a shift share Bartik instrument is. This is from Timothy Bartik's book. He's trying to find an instrument that is shifting labor demand. What he says is, obvious candidates for instruments are variables shifting city-level labor demand curves. In this book, only one type of demand shifter is used to form the instrumental variables. So he doesn't experiment with lots of IVs. He has committed to one for the entire book. So all of his tables are based on this one book, and in the appendix, he's explaining its construction. He's saying it's the share effect from a shift share analysis of each city and its city's area and the year-to-year employment change. Now, what does that mean? A shift share analysis decomposes a city's growth in employment into three components: national growth, which calculates what growth would have occurred if all industries in the city had grown at the national average; a share component, which calculates what each growth would have occurred if each industry in the city had grown at the industry's national average; and a shift component, which calculates the extra growth that occurs because industries grow at different rates locally than they do nationally. So as my best understanding of this, it's like you're going to have differential growth rates for each of these industries, but the way that it's going to be constructed is an interaction between the national growth and the initial shares of your geographic region or your industry, okay? See if we can unpack that a little bit more. So what is it? The idea behind a Bartik instrument is to measure the change. I'm going to say labor demand, but it's used for all kinds of things. The change in a region's labor demand due to changes in the national demand for different industry products, okay? So we're going to have here, I'm going to put it in terms of immigration. Y is going to be earnings in some location, some city called Detroit, in some time period. All right, 2000. So I'm looking at the effect. I want to know the effect of changes in immigration in some area on changes in earnings. I is going to be immigration flows at that period. Okay, and X is going to be a bunch of controls. So deeply endogenous. It's a simultaneous equations kind of thing. This is, you know, immigration and earnings are being simultaneously determined. This is just, you know, the intersection of labor demand and labor supply. So you can't recover the causal effect from just regressing earnings onto immigration, all right? Immigration is almost certainly correlated with the error term because of these simultaneity problems. So we're going to do shift shares. So what is a share? The shares are the initial shares of a geographic region prior to the immigration flow. Okay, so you're interacting, the instrument is going to be an interactant of the share of a geographic region prior to the immigration flow with some kind of national growth rate in immigration, right? The deviations of a region's growth from that national average. So say that Bogota, is it, I can't, I'm sorry, I've already forgotten how to, everybody, keep getting corrected. It grows differently than Colombia, okay? Differently Colombia. So what is it? It's a deviation from the national growth rate. So maybe it grows at 5%, but Colombia grows at 10%. How are you gonna get at that? You're gonna interact that initial share with that growth rate, and that's gonna give you actually a deviation. It's going to get it. These deviations are due to shares because the national growth rate is the same for everybody. All right. Here's the instrument. All right. So constructing the instrument, look at what you're doing. You're going to have this share interacted with an overall change. You're going to sum it up, and that's going to be your instrument. So the first term is the share variable, right here, Z, for location L, country K, right? So you've got basically the share of immigrants from Mexico in Detroit in the first period, right? So you're just going to calculate that share, all right? K is over all the countries. And then what we're going to have is MKT. This is going to be the change in immigration in Mexico for America as a whole, all right? So you're going to calculate, this is going to be some percentage change, and this is going to be a share of a city that is coming from Mexico. So you've got here Mexico, right? But this is a city level. This is a city level term because you've got L. So notice how ultimately it becomes a city level term, and it's at time periods. Okay, so B is going to be the predicted flow. I mean, it's not literally predicted, it's an actual instrument, but it's basically going to be the predicted flow of immigrants into destination L, which is Detroit. It's going to be a weighted average of the national inflow rates from each country. It's a complicated instrument, to me it is. And the weights are going to be these initial shares, okay? Now, the estimator is not complicated. It's two-stage least squares. We're going to regress immigration onto our controls and our bartik instrument using the fitted values from that regression. Oh, so that should have been I hat. Sorry, that should be I hat. Using the fitted values from that regression, I hat. Then we're going to regress earnings onto I hat. And the idea is that we're only using the exogenous variation of immigration that comes from our instrument. But most of what I'm going to talk about now is what exactly does that mean? And under what assumptions will this recover the impact of immigration onto log wages? So there's two views on this. There's Goldsmith-Pinkham et al.'s 2020 view that focuses just on the exogenous shares. And there's Borisak et al.'s 2019 Review of Economic Studies paper, it's revised and we submit, that focuses on the shift part. We're going to take them in turns. They're not in contradiction to each other. They're just simply complementary views. They're basically, if you believe that you have exogenous shares, you're in a world of Goldsmith-Pinkham. And if you have exogenous shifts, then you're in a world of Borisak. Okay? And we're going to talk about each of them. What is the exogenous share view? This is from Goldsmith-Pinkham et al. The bartik instrument is basically the same thing as using local industry shares as instruments. It's what it collapses to in the GMM. He does this general method of moments kind of analysis of the bartik instrument. And what he shows is the instrument is essentially identical to those industry shares, right? The exogeneity, what the shock is doing is it's giving you differential. You're getting variation rather from the let's see, hold on. What is the shift doing for you? Oh, sorry. Yeah, the shift. So what you're getting is your instrument is the shares. And that's why so much of what you're going to talk about here is, can I defend that the shares are the shares are exogenous? So what do the shifts do? The shifts are responsible for your first stage, okay? But the shares are giving you exogenous variation. So that's really important. That means you've got to defend the exogeneity of those shares, okay? Now that's practically difficult. Why is that practically difficult? Well, think about it. It's almost like in a difference in differences. Think about when you're doing a differences in differences. There's 51 states in the United States, okay? You've got to argue that each of those states are getting the treatment for reasons that are orthogonal to the error term, okay? Well, that's 51 states. It's a lot. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to go review 51 newspaper, history of newspapers in those cities or those states, try to figure out why this law was passed. It can be exogenous some, and it can be endogenous in others, right? Well, bartik is the same thing. The United States has 400 industries, for instance, right? How are you going to interpret the bartik instrument just to say that all 400 of those are exogenous? When you multiply that over multiple time periods, the exclusion restriction becomes hard to defend, if only because you've got thousands of instruments, okay? Or not thousands of instruments, but 400, since it collapses to the 400 shares, it becomes harder to defend the restriction. But Goldsmith-Pinkham provide a lot of suggestions for evaluating the central assumption. There's over-identification tests, there's pre-tests that are done that are basically versions of difference and differences. But I want to show you one thing they do. They've got this thing called Rodenberg weights. Rodenberg, it's actually interesting. Rodenberg is this economist that was at Harvard, and he wrote this paper, and it had these weights in it. I think it was like an econometrics paper. It was these weights, and essentially the paper never got cited. I think before Goldsmith-Pinkham, it had been cited one time, and that was like 20 years ago. Rodenberg has now passed away. He died of cancer several years ago. But it was interesting. Goldsmith-Pinkham, Swinson, and Sorkin, okay? They show, when they decompose the bartik estimator, that it's a weighted combination of those shares. So you remember how I said all the shares are instruments? It's not just that they're shared. It's not just that the shares are equally instruments. It's actually a weighted average over all those instruments. What are the weights? It's these weights that Rodenberg discovered 20 years ago. They're called Rodenberg weights, and they sum to 1. Now, why does that matter? Because not all the weights are equal. So what happens is, since they all sum to 1, you can actually look in those Rodenberg weights and see which industries are driving your results. And so in their analysis, for instance, of this one David Otter paper, most of the instruments was coming from like 3 to 5 industries. Now, why does that matter? Because that means that's all you have to focus on, and that's the only ones you're going to really have to defend as being excludable, right? So if those high weighted areas pass some basic specification tests, then you might have more confidence, in your design than if it was just simply having to defend 400, different industries being exogenous. Most of them actually practically, it looks like in a lot of situations, it's really going to be a few shares that are driving it. Thankfully, Paul and the co-authors have made their data, their state of do file available on this GitHub. And let's see where we get here. So download this. Let's look at my GitHub. I got it downloaded over here. Scott Cunningham, Git, Shift Share. So everything now is zipped. Here I've got the ado package, right? So I think I can, let me see if I've already installed this. I may not have installed this yet. I think I did. Yeah, it's got this really great program you can install. Creates shock level aggregates for Shift Share IV. It's really, goes into a lot of detail. Converts oh, look at this. This is actually, oh, this is the, no, I'm sorry, this is not. Yeah, it is. Okay, I'll figure this out actually, because this looks like this is, I'll get back to you on this. I don't see the Rottenberg weights in here anymore. Something changed. I'll get back to this. Maybe it's in here. Anyway, there's code. I'll figure out why that code's not what I thought it was. It used to be different. Something's changed. So you can focus, but you can do this. That one it looks like is doing the next one, right? But Paul has a bartik Rottenberg weight. Man, where is it? Hold on, this is kind of driving me crazy for a second. You know what? I think that Paul has this. Bartik weight, there it is. Okay, here it is. It's under bartik weight. Okay, so this is great. Paul has made code for both his approach, the share approach that will calculate the Rottenberg weights. All right, so the Rottenberg weights are in here. All right, so you can do it. You've got to go through all this stuff, make the Rottenberg summary. And then he's also, incredibly enough, made an ado package for a competitor, the competing IV bartik paper. It's really gracious. So let's look at this. Let me summarize this. So that is the that is what I see as one of the main contributions. The two main contributions of that Goldsmith Pinkham paper is, one, it really clarifies what the instrument is. It's the exogenous shifts. I'm sorry, the exogenous shares, and from that we get weights on those shares because each instrument basically ends up being a share. And then what we get is Rottenberg weights. Now we still have this over-identification issue. So he does mention that here because we have lots of instruments. Again, that's what makes it kind of similar. You know, that actually, so something that Georgie had said, this is actually something that makes, was it Georgie, whoever said that, makes this kind of similar to Judge Fixed Effects. Even though it's a single instrument, his GMM results show that it's actually multiple instruments. And so every instrument is every share is an instrument, which means you're going to have to deal with some over-identification tests. But over-identification tests always assume constant treatment effects. So he goes into a lot of suggestions about how to evaluate this. All right, Rottenberg weights, two things, all right? Really great paper. Highly recommend you read the paper. The introduction to the paper is incredibly well written. When you discuss the intuition behind the exclusion restriction in the migration example, it seems to me that there are different ways which the predicted inflows would affect Y directly, not only through contemporary inflows. The exclusion restriction. So this would mean that the share of Detroit, let's look at it real quick. All right, so this would mean here, okay, since it's primarily coming from shares in this exogenous share situation, you've got to say that, I think what you've got to say is that the share of immigrants, Mexican immigrants in Detroit in the year 1990, since this is like the year 2000 right here, say that's the year 2000. You've got to say, well, in that, the average wages in that city, Detroit in 2000, it can only be related to the share of the city in 1990 that were Mexican via the effect that has on Mexican Detroit level immigration flows. So you're basically saying there's nothing about that city. Yeah, it's the deviation. It's not actually a prior migration inflow. It's the deviation in Detroit's immigration flow from the national immigration flow, right? So conceptually, it's just like, well, Detroit's immigration flow grew 5%. The nation grew 10%. But it's in the calculation of that instrument that is truly bartik. And what bartik is going to be is a share of the city in 1990 that was Mexican interacted with a national growth rate. And so as a result of that, you're having to, since Paul, Isaac, and Harold or Henry, since they show it's really Z that's driving the results, you have to say that there is nothing about Mexican shares of the population in that city in 1990 that could affect 2000's earnings except via its growth rates at the time. So you've got to argue that, you know, there is no, that share in 1990 is completely orthogonal to epsilon in 2000. Now, how could that be violated? I got to think a little bit about how to be violating that, Conference Ista. So give me a minute to think about that. But let's go ahead and take a break real quick. It's 10:50. Well, is it hard to argue? Paul worked out the econometrics with Henry and Isaac, Isaac Sorkin and Henry Swinson and Paul Goldsmith Pinkham. So they worked it out, right? They worked out all the econometrics. They did that generalized method of moments. They found those Rodenberg weights, and they provided a real public service to people in immigration, labor, and trade, right? But when you talk to Paul, he just thinks you probably should just be doing another design because it's really hard to defend it, in his opinion. But that's the thing, I think that just because it in principle, just because you believe in practice it's going to be hard to defend it, doesn't mean that it is in principle hard to defend it. I guess I just don't feel comfortable abstractly saying that identifying assumptions are hard to defend. I don't, because the theorems show that they mathematically exist. So it's going to be in your project that whether or not it's hard to defend. Okay, and you're going to have to think about what that exogeneity violation would look like, and you're going to probably need to go through some of Paul's, Henry's, and Isaac's kind of recommendations. Okay, good. All right, so let's stop there and come back at 11:05. All right, let's stop and come back at 11:05.